Hey everyone, what's up? This is part 7 in the Create a WhatsApp web clone with Appwrite and Vue.js. So let's jump right into things. In this video we're going to be continuing with the group creation stuff. We were able to create our first group. We created a function to add the members to the group, and now we want to display the groups on our main view over here. So if we just take a look at the back end, there's something I wanted to point out before we continue. So if we look at our functions, and we can see that we have variables. We also have the settings with the execute access. Now, it's very important that we actually deploy it differently. In the last video, we manually created these things, but the issue with that is that when we want to move it to a different environment, it won't really work because Appwrite doesn't really know. Let me explain a bit better. If we look at our code, so you can see we have an appwrite.json. I already modified this a little bit. If we look at what it looked like before, it essentially did not have this variables property, and it also didn't have this execute any in here. Essentially, you want to add the execute any, and you want to add the variables property with these two variables: Appwrite function endpoint, which is the Appwrite function endpoint, and the Appwrite function API key, which is the Appwrite function API key. And that way, when we go to Appwrite deploy function, once you do that for the first time, add members and enter, it'll ask you sure you want to override. You click yes, and then even if we delete this function, and let me just show you what I mean. If we delete this function, okay, and then we deploy it again, so it's deploying it, etc. Awesome. And if we go back to here, you'll see that it actually preserves the configuration. This is a bug with Appwrite at the moment, but if you just deploy it again, for some reason it doesn't deploy the variables when it creates the function. So let's just do that one more time and refresh. And you can see now that we have the variables over here. And that way we can just move this appwrite.json file to our production environment, for example, and redeploy it, and we'll keep all the same configuration options that we had in our local development environment. And that's super important in general across the board, is that any change you make in the console, you're also going to want to make it in the appwrite.json file, or just start off in your appwrite.json file. So if we wanted to change the execution permissions, so you just delete it here and then deploy the function. That way you're able to move your Appwrite project across multiple environments. And we're going to be using this Appwrite.json file a little bit more once we create our first database and add more Appwrite functions, and we'll see what that's like a little bit more a little bit later on. But for now, let's get back to what we wanted to do, and that is to show our list of groups. So if we go to the contacts sidebar page, so essentially this is where we want to show the groups. So what we need is, we're going to need a chat list component, and that's where we're going to show a list of our chats. So let's create a new component. Let's probably put this in sidebar, chat list .view, and we're going to make a template as well as our script setup lang equals ts, and this is where we're going to render out our groups. So what it's going to need is in its props interface, props. So we're going to basically want the chats, and that's going to be models from can be imported from appwrite.team, and basically just an array of teams, and we're going to define props. Okay, cool. Once we have that in place, let's actually just pass that in. So if we go back to our contact sidebar, we're going to basically make a const chats is equal to a ref of models dot team, an array, and it'll start off as an empty array. And then when this component is mounted, let's just import that by pasting it over here. When this component is mounted, we want to say chats.value is equal to get groups. Cool. Await great groups. So that's async and then await. get groups. And essentially the groups will return us the models.team, which means that that's correct. Cool. So now that we have that set up, we're going to want to import our chat list underneath this section, chat list. And this will just have a class of height full, and it will accept as a parameter chats, which is going to be equal to chats. And let's just import that. Cool. So now if we go into our chat list component, we're going to need to create the actual chat items. So let's go to our markup and say main, which is going to have a class of divide y, which is going to basically put a border between each of our chat item components, and overflow y auto, which is going to allow us to scroll. And now we need to create a new component called chat item.view. And essentially the chat item will be where each individual, well, chat item is going to go. So script setup lang equals ts. And if we think what it needs in terms of props, so we're going to need interface props. It's going to get a single chat, which will be models.chat. Models.team. And that comes from Appwrite. And then we're going to define the props, and that's going to have that. All right. And then the next thing we're going to do is just create the markup for this. So we're going to have a div, and the div will have a class of flex items center. And just to remind you all, this is, I mean, you could take a look at your WhatsApp web for a reference, but we're essentially going to be creating the individual row on the chat list, basically that defines a group or a contact that you're chatting with. So padding x of 2, when we hover it, we want it BG gray of 100. We're going to want padding y of 4, cursor pointer, and relative. All right, very nice. Now that we have that created, we need to import our avatar component. So just going to be a simple avatar for now. Now we want to have the actual chat name stuff. So let's do div class equals flex. It's going to be a flex column, ml margin left of 3. Inside here, we're going to have a div that's going to be unstyled. It'll just have the chat.name. And then let's just say for here, just a placeholder text. And this is really where the most recent message of this group is going to go. But for now, we're just going to say, let's make it a text small, text gray 500. And then inside here, we're going to say there are no messages yet. Something like that, just for now. And then we also want to have when this group was created. So span, we're going to have a class is equal to text xs, extra small, text gray 400, and then absolute top 5 right 4. And then we're just going to have the created at property. The way we'll do that is just say, let's just format the date a little bit. So we have props, and we're going to say const created at is equal to computed, and essentially we're just going to say the constant date is equal to new date of props.chat.created at times 1000, just because of the way it's stored. Let's just import computed from Vue, and then we're going to return the formatted string. So these guys, and we're going to say we want the date.getDate, which is the day of the month, then slash date.getMonth, then slash date.getFullYear, get full year. And then we're going to essentially just put this property right in here, create it at. Okay, cool. And now if we go back to our chat list, we're gonna just say over here chat item and import that. I'm gonna say v4 equals chat in chats. We're gonna pass it a chat property, and that should be good for now. Cool. So if we take a look at what this actually looks like on our UI, we'll see here that we now have the group we created. So if we create a new group, for example, and just say new group, and let's just say test1@gmail.com, enter, next. We have the group name is going to be test group 2, for example. Just create that. Okay, it should take us back. It's not taking us back. It seems like we do have an issue with that failed to resolve component chat list, so we'll deal with that in a second. If I refresh though, we'll see that we now have 2 chat items. Okay, so we have a few things we need to do. So first of all, it says the chat list. It doesn't know that it's a native component, but I think that was just because we hadn't yet imported it, so that's fine for now. And the other bug that we have is that once we create a group, so we want to be taken back to the main page. So we want to say when we check item create the group, so it goes to group store create group. Then once we do that, I think we just want to navigate back to the main page. So let's just see how we're gonna do that. We're gonna want to use the group store, and then we're just gonna say where were we in the new info group. So we say make this async. We're gonna say await the group store create group, and then we just want to go back to global store dot show sidebar view dot contacts. Okay, and if we just run through the flow one more time, we want to refresh first, new group, and just call this test. Sorry, this is gonna be test again 1@gmail.com. Enter. Next, group name is going to be group 3, for example. Let's create that, and we now have group 3. Something to note over here is that we can actually just prove this now. If we go to our authentication, so you see we have 2 test Gmail accounts, and these were created when we actually created the group, since we added a new member. We don't know what the password to these accounts are yet, so let's just update the password over here. Now, I think I mentioned this in the previous video, but I'll mention it again. Generally, the flow is when you invite a member to a group is it sends them an email, and when they click on the link to the email, they will be prompted to create an account. So then they'll know what their password is. But since we're not doing that flow, because we don't want to set up email, we're just going to manually update the password for now. That's ABCD1234 update. And now if we try to sign in to this test1@gmail.com, so let's just open up a new incognito window. Let's go to our project 5714 slash, let's just go here. It should take us to login. And login ABCD1234, and we log in there. So you'll see that we now have 2 groups, right? And the reason for that is because we invited, if we look at the teams, so we can see we have awesome people, test group 2, and group 3. So if you look at awesome people, there are 2 members. One is test@gmail.com, the other one is me, this account. And if we look over here, this since we logged into test1@gmail.com, so they have access to these 2 groups. That means our groups are working correctly now, and we're one step closer to creating our final product. Cool. So once we got there, the next thing we want to do is make a list of our contacts. So if we go to the new group page here, you can see that, let me just refresh that. If we go to the new group here, you can see that we have to type a new contact name. The thing is, we now have contacts because we have test@gmail.com, who we are in a common group with, and we have test and test1. Basically, these are now our contacts, so we want to be able to show them. And the way we need to show them is by essentially creating a database. So we're going to start with creating a database in this video. We're probably not going to finish it because we also have to create an Appwrite function for this. But essentially, we're going to create that database now. So let me just pull this off to the side over here, and let's build the database. Okay, fine. So go to databases, and an Appwrite database is a fairly standard database. So we're going to want to create a database, and we're going to call the database ID called WhatsApp, and the name is going to be WhatsApp create. Inside here, we're going to create a collection, which we're going to call contacts. And this is how we're going to store all of our contacts. And contacts. And you can see here, we now have a collection or a table in SQL, or a collection in MongoDB or NoSQL things, in NoSQL databases. So the first thing we want to do is enable the document security. In fact, let's actually go back to what I was saying before in terms of making sure appwrite.json is synced with our DB, or with our console. So if I just do appwrite init collection, maybe collections, and we want to, from which database you'd like to, so we want to take from WhatsApp, enter. And if you look here, appwrite.json now has the correct metadata so that we'll be able to deploy this somewhere else. Cool. Something we're missing still is attributes and indexes, and we'll get those in a second. So let's go here. So the first thing we need are attributes, and attributes are essentially the columns in the database. So we're going to want a new string attribute, and this is going to be the user ID, which is essentially the current user. We're going to say ties it's 255, and it's required. We're going to now add another attribute called contact ID, and this is essentially going to be the user's contact. This is required, it's 255, and let's create that as well. And the last thing we're going to need is an email attribute, and this is going to be email, and this is going to be the email of the contact. Cool. Now the next thing we need to do is add some indexes. So just to explain for a second about our database structure. Essentially, for every combination of user ID and contact ID, that will symbolize a contact relationship. So for example, if we look at our authentications, so we're going to say we're going to have a combination of the ID of Jacob at test along with the ID of this. So that's one contact. The next contact is going to be Jacob at test with this user. And the same goes for each of these users. This is going to have the user ID, and this is going to be the contact ID, and this will be the user ID, and this will be the contact ID. And essentially we'll be able to create every single contact relationship like that. And we're going to keep it all in sync with an Appwrite function that is triggered on a Appwrite event. But we'll get more into that in a second. So if we go back to our database, so we have our contacts, we have our attributes. So what we want to make sure is that there can never be a duplicate of the same user ID and contact ID. So let's actually add a unique index. So we're going to add an index, and this is going to be called user contact, and this is going to be a unique index, which is going to be a combination of the user ID and the contact ID. And if you don't understand this, just leave a comment and I'll explain it a little bit more. Okay, fine. So that's a user ID. This is a unique index, and we're going to create it. We're going to want to add another index, which is going to be a key, and this is just going to be called a user ID index. And this is just going to be so we're able to query all of the user ID's contacts. And let's create that. All right, cool. And with that done, let's run appwrite init collection again so that we get the updated indexes. And if you look in the attributes and indexing thing, you'll see an update happen. Bam. And there we have the user ID. We also have our indexes. And cool. So now, in order for us to actually populate this table, right, all the documents here rather, what we're going to need to do is create an Appwrite function which is triggered when members are added to a group. So if we look at functions for a second, you can see that if we add a function, oh, I don't really want to add a function yet. You can see that there are ways of making it triggered on a specific event. So we can say at any time a membership is created, we want to trigger the Appwrite function, which will then go through all the teams and create the relationships for contacts. But we're going to leave that for the next video since we're a little bit over 20 minutes. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.